The air is heavy with the scent of smoke and tallow. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls once, slow and hollow, fading into the thick night. You find yourself standing in the hush of a medieval kitchen, not the polished, candlelit halls of legend, but the true heart of a castle where warmth and hunger meet. The glow from a single fire breathes against the stone walls, painting them in shades of amber and ash. Shadows stretch like ghosts across the flagstones, and from above, wooden beams drip with the memory of countless fires long extinguished. The sound of crackling embers seems to pulse like a heartbeat, slow and steady, drawing you closer. A pot hangs over the open flame, its sides blackened with years of use. Steam coils upward, carrying with it the sharp tang of onions, the earthy depth of barley, and the faint sweetness of something rare, perhaps honey, or the last bit of dried fruit left from last season's store. Every smell tells a story, of labor, of survival, of hands that worked from dawn to darkness. You can almost hear them still, the shuffle of boots across stone, the low murmur of voices, the scrape of knives on wooden boards. The air feels alive with the rhythm of centuries. This is where the real life of the medieval world began each day, not in thrones or towers, but here, beside the fire. The kitchen was the pulse of existence, where hunger met hope, where the line between life and death could be as thin as a loaf of bread. The people who stood in these rooms knew no luxury in their craft. They stirred, chopped, roasted, and endured, not for glory but because someone had to feed the household. Behind every grand feast, every royal meal sung about in song and story, there was a place like this, hot, loud, and endlessly human. The heat here is constant, almost sacred. It burns the skin, dries the lips, and stains every breath with smoke. Yet for all its harshness, there is comfort in the glow, the steady, living flame that refuses to die. In the flicker of light, the past feels close enough to touch. You imagine the cook, perhaps a woman with roughened hands and a quiet strength, standing before the fire with the patience of someone who knows that food takes time, that nothing worth having comes quickly. Each movement she makes is deliberate, practiced, almost ritualistic. The stirring of the pot, the sprinkling of salt, the taste on the tip of a wooden spoon, it's all a kind of prayer to the moment, a conversation between person and flame. Outside the kitchen, the world sleeps under the weight of stars. The castle walls hold the cold at bay, but only just. Inside, the fire hums and the kitchen lives. A boy no older than 12 turns the great iron spit by hand, watching the slow rotation of a goose roasting to golden perfection. His eyes droop with exhaustion, but he does not stop. To rest would invite the cook's scorn, or worse, a lashing from the steward. Each turn of the spit is another breath, another heartbeat in the rhythm of this ancient room. And still, the smells deepen, roasted meat, singed herbs, the damp earthiness of spilled ale on the floor. Somewhere in the background, bread bakes within a clay oven, its crust hardening to a perfect crackle. The sound is faint, but it carries warmth, the kind of sound that could make even the poorest soul feel, for a brief moment, that life was kind. This kitchen is no place of glamour, yet it hums with a beauty that only time can reveal. Every scorch mark, every darkened beam, every worn knife handle is a relic of endurance. The medieval kitchen was not only a place of work but a sanctuary of necessity. In its walls lived the pulse of community, servants, cooks, children, and animals all bound together by the same fire. Theirs was a language of survival, spoken not with words but with gestures. The passing of a ladle, the nod of approval when the stew finally thickened, the shared silence of fatigue at the end of a long day. To them, food was more than nourishment. It was connection, a fragile thread linking life to life, hand to hand, fire to flame. As you linger in this place, time begins to blur. The centuries seem to peel away, leaving only the simple truths that never changed, that hunger is eternal, that warmth is fleeting, and that every meal, whether a noble's feast or a peasant's bowl, is a small defiance against the dark. The kitchen holds all of it, the smoke, the laughter, the exhaustion, the prayers whispered under breath when the larder ran low. It is not romantic, not noble, but it is real, achingly real, and in its reality lies a quiet kind of grace. The fire pops once, sending a flurry of sparks into the air. They rise and fade, glowing briefly before vanishing into the blackness above. The boy at the spit exhales, his face half lit by the dying flame. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, the night wind howls, but here, within the circle of light, there is stillness, the kind that only comes after a day of endless work. The scent of smoke lingers, thick and ancient, and the kitchen sighs as if the walls themselves remember. You close your eyes for a moment, and in that silence, you can almost feel the centuries breathe. This kitchen, this fire, this moment, they are echoes of the same human rhythm that beats through time. The scent of the past is everywhere, woven into the stones, carried by the smoke, lingering in the warmth that touches your skin. It is the scent of life itself, fragile, fleeting, and forever reaching toward the light. Beyond the glittering feasts and echoing laughter of the great hall, a very different world existed. It was hidden behind thick oak doors and narrow stone corridors, a world few nobles ever entered, yet one that sustained them entirely. The kitchen was the true heart of every castle, the unseen engine that turned raw earth and toil into luxury. Here, there were no silks or jewels, no music or merriment, only the low roar of the fire and the hum of constant labor. This was the place where the grandeur of medieval life began, not in glory, but in sweat and smoke. The space was vast yet claustrophobic, its ceilings blackened with soot from generations of burning wood. Smoke lingered in the air like fog, clinging to clothes, skin, and breath. Torches flickered in iron sconces, throwing restless light upon the faces of those who worked. Servants scurried through narrow pathways between tables and barrels, their movements swift and silent, trained by fear and repetition. Each had their task, one chopped, another stirred, another scrubbed. The sound of knives against wood mixed with the hiss of boiling pots and the rhythmic thud of kneading hands. It was chaos and order in equal measure, a choreography of survival that played out every day from dawn to deep night. At the center of it all stood the head cook, often a person of great authority, though their name rarely survived in records. Their voice carried through the kitchen like the toll of a bell, sharp, commanding, absolute. Every dish, every servant, every movement was under their control. Their mind held hundreds of recipes, measurements, and rules, most never written down. To serve the Lord's table was not simply to cook, but to perform a kind of alchemy, transforming humble grains and flesh into symbols of status. The cook's hands were calloused, their patience forged through years of mistakes and triumphs. They knew that one burnt dish could mean disgrace or worse, punishment. Around them worked a hierarchy of bodies, the bustling scullions, the nimble turnspits, the weary washerwomen, and the butchers who moved with grim precision. The air rang with their effort. A young boy crouched by the hearth, turning the heavy iron spit with aching arms. He dared not stop, for if the meat charred unevenly, his back would pay the price. Near him, a girl barely older than 14 poured boiling water into a cauldron, her face slick with sweat, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The floor was wet and slippery, covered in scraps of bone and peel, the residue of endless meals that would never bear their names. Yet despite the exhaustion, a strange rhythm pulsed through the place, a shared understanding that what they did mattered, even if no one saw it. On the far side of the room, near the small arched window where a wisp of night air sometimes crept in, stood the baker. His hands were thick with flour, his arms strong from years of kneading. He worked alone, apart from the clamor, tending his dough as though it were something sacred. The bread was the soul of the household. Its absence meant hunger, its success meant peace. In noble households, bread came in many kinds, the fine white loaves for the Lord's table, the coarse brown ones for servants, and the dark rye loaves for those lowest on the ladder. Each bite was a reminder of rank, even within the same walls. And above them all, unseen but ever-present, loomed the steward, the master of provisions. His was a quiet, chilling power. He oversaw the stores, measured the salt, rationed the wine, counted the eggs. He walked through the kitchen like a shadow, his presence enough to silence conversation. One missing chicken, one broken jar of ale, and questions would follow. Every crumb was accounted for, every barrel sealed and marked. In this system of control, Food was not only sustenance, it was currency, politics, and punishment. Beyond the main kitchen lay smaller rooms. The scullery, where greasy water pooled in basins and servants scrubbed pots blackened beyond recognition. The buttery, where ale and wine were measured out with strict care. And the pantry, filled with the dry, comforting scent of flour, grains, and salt. Each chamber hummed with purpose. Each servant knew their place, for order was survival. To falter was to draw the wrong kind of attention. And yet, in the rare quiet moments, when the fire dimmed and the cook's voice faded, laughter sometimes slipped through the cracks. A joke, a stolen crust of bread, a shared glance in the midst of exhaustion. Humanity endured, even here, beneath the weight of duty. Outside these walls, the great hall gleamed with polished wood, gold plates, and perfumed candles. The Lord sat in comfort, his guests marveling at the endless procession of dishes that appeared as if by magic. They spoke of wealth, of power, of God's blessings. None of them thought of the tired hands that made it possible. They did not see the burns on the cook's arms, or the blistered feet of the servant who carried platters up the narrow stair. Between the banquet and the kitchen lay an invisible line, one side shining with glory, the other swallowed in smoke. The contrast was absolute. For the nobles, food was spectacle. For the workers, it was survival. One dined to display power, the other labored to avoid hunger. And yet both worlds met here, behind those doors, in this hidden chamber where fire ruled. The kitchen was the great equalizer, indifferent to class, indifferent to wealth. It demanded effort, patience, and respect. No crown could command bread to rise faster, no title could change the way meat burned if left unattended. Here, skill mattered more than blood. As night deepened, the chaos softened into something quieter. The last dishes were scrubbed, the fire banked low. The cook inspected the room one final time, her face lit by the dim glow of embers. She touched the edge of a wooden table worn smooth by years of service and exhaled. Around her, the others moved like ghosts, tired, silent, but alive. Beyond the wall, music still drifted from the great hall, muffled by distance. Laughter rose and fell, and for a moment, she allowed herself a faint smile. Tomorrow, it would begin again, the fire rekindled, the same endless rhythm of work and want. But for now, the kitchen breathed in peace. This was where history truly lived, not in battles or crowns, but in rooms like this, filled with heat and human hands. The castle's heart did not beat in the throne room. It beat here, behind the great hall, where the real work happened, where life was forged in smoke and flame, and where every meal told a story of both labor and love. The fire was everything. It burned at the center of the medieval kitchen like a living creature, breathing, shifting, demanding constant care. Without it, life within the castle walls would wither. Before iron stoves or chimneys, before the hum of modern machines, there was only the open hearth, its heat raw and merciless. The kitchen's existence revolved around its rhythm. Every meal, every hour, every heartbeat followed the fire's will. You can almost feel it, the dry heat pressing against your face, the sting of smoke in your eyes, the faint hiss as dripping fat meets glowing ash. The hearth itself was a massive structure, built from stone and brick, sometimes large enough for a person to stand inside. In grand castles, several fires might burn at once. One for roasting, one for boiling, another for baking. Iron chains hung from beams above, their links blackened and slick with years of grease. Hooks and cauldrons swung from them like pendulums, each one holding some essential part of the day's meal. To keep the flame alive was an act of devotion. Too much wood and the food would scorch, too little, and it would never cook through. Fire was temperamental, sacred, and feared. Those who tended it knew its moods better than they knew their own reflection. Around the main hearth sprawled a world of tools that to modern eyes might seem primitive, yet each had purpose. Heavy iron pots, thick enough to withstand years of flame, rested on tripods or were suspended above the coals. Skillets with long handles allowed cooks to reach deep into the fire without burning themselves. Wooden spoons the size of oars stirred soups and pottages that simmered for hours. Long knives gleamed faintly in the firelight, their blades dulled from endless sharpening. A mortar and pestle sat nearby, waiting to grind herbs, garlic, or coarse salt. Nothing was idle, every object bore the mark of necessity. The roasting spit dominated the space, a long iron rod mounted horizontally before the fire. Turning it required stamina and attention. Meat had to rotate constantly, slow enough to cook through, steady enough to brown evenly. Young boys, often orphans or servants' children, were assigned to the spit, their small hands red from the heat, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They were called turnspit boys, and they worked for hours, sometimes using ropes or crude treadmills to keep the meat turning. It was grueling, monotonous work, but vital. One moment of distraction could ruin the feast, and punishment was swift. Yet even in their suffering, these children were part of a tradition that stretched across centuries, the unseen hands that fed the mighty. In the corner of the kitchen stood the ovens, domed and built from clay or stone. They were heated by firewood piled inside and left to burn until the walls glowed red. The ashes were then scraped out, and the residual heat baked bread, pies, and pastries. Timing was everything. Skilled bakers knew by instinct how hot the oven was, by holding their hand inside for a brief second, by watching the color of the stone, by listening to the whisper of the heat. Bread was more than food. It was a daily ritual of patience and precision. When the first loaves emerged, golden and fragrant, the entire room filled with warmth that no torch could match. Water hissed in copper cauldrons. Fat popped and sizzled. Steam clouded the air, carrying with it the sense of roasting meat, simmering herbs, and faint sweetness from baked fruit. The kitchen sounds formed a kind of music, steady, ancient, hypnotic. Each sound told a story. The thud of a pestle meant herbs were being crushed for medicine or flavor. The crack of splitting firewood meant more fuel for survival. The cook moved through it all like a conductor, her hands stained and strong, her senses finely tuned. She could tell the temperature of a stew by its bubbles, the readiness of bread by its scent. To her, these were not chores but instincts honed by years of necessity. The walls were lined with shelves holding everything from dried beans and salted meat to bunches of herbs strung upside down to dry. Bay leaves, sage, and thyme perfumed the air, mingling with the smoke. Near the hearth, barrels of ale stood ready to quench thirst or flavor stews. Jugs of oil, pots of honey, and crocks of lard glistened faintly in the firelight. These were the treasures of the kitchen, precious not for luxury, but for endurance. Every ingredient had value. Waste was unthinkable. To waste food was to tempt hunger itself. For all its industry, the medieval kitchen was also a place of quiet communion. The people who worked here understood that they were tending not just to food, but to life itself. Their labor sustained the castle, the household, the village beyond. A burned loaf or spoiled meat could mean hunger for many. In this sense, the kitchen was both sanctuary and battleground, where the war against time, decay, and want was fought daily. Each flicker of the flame was a small victory against darkness. When winter came, the fire became even more sacred. It was warmth against the chill, light against the endless nights. People would gather near it not only to cook but to talk, to share stories, to thaw their fingers after hours of outdoor labor. Sometimes, a musician or servant would hum softly, the tune rising and falling with the crackle of the logs. There was a strange comfort in that unity, an unspoken bond among those who knew what it meant to endure. As the night deepened, the kitchen began to quiet. The day's smoke hung low, curling through beams and rafters like a ghost unwilling to leave. The fire, once roaring, now glowed with the steady red of dying embers. The last pot was set aside, its contents left to cool for tomorrow's meal. The cook sat by the hearth, rubbing her tired hands together, her face illuminated by the final light. Around her, the kitchen seemed to exhale, walls creaking softly, coals shifting with a faint sigh. The day's labor had ended, but the heart of the place never stopped beating. Even in stillness, the fire spoke, a language older than words, older than kings. It whispered of hunger and survival, of warmth and memory. The medieval kitchen was not merely a room, it was a living organism, sustained by those who served it and by the flame they guarded. Every crack in the stone, every stain on the wall, every blackened pot told the same truth. that here, in the dance between fire and flesh, humanity had carved its place in time. The hearth's light flickered once more, as if nodding in approval to the day's work. Beyond its glow, darkness spread through the corridors of the castle, cold and absolute. Yet within this space, warmth lingered, fragile, flickering, eternal. The fire might sleep for the night, but it would rise again with dawn, its breath ready to feed the living once more. In that endless rhythm of heat and hunger, the medieval kitchen found its heartbeat, steady, patient, eternal. What they ate in the Middle Ages was not the stuff of royal banquets or feasts sung about by poets. Not for most, at least. For every golden-roasted swan or jeweled pie served in the great halls, there were hundreds of rough loaves, watery stews, and meals made from what the land could barely offer. Food was survival, not indulgence. It came from the soil, from weather and chance, and it tasted of hard work, sweat, and endurance. To sit down to eat in the medieval world was to confront the fragile line between plenty and hunger. The day began with bread, always bread. Coarse, heavy, dark as earth, made from barley, rye, or oats. Wheat, the grain we take for granted today, was rare and precious. Only the wealthy could afford the pale, soft loaves baked from fine flour. For the poor, bread was thick and rough, sometimes mixed with ground peas or beans to make it stretch further. It filled the belly, even when it offered little strength. At times of famine, sawdust or ground acorns were mixed into the dough, a bitter trick to fool hunger into silence. Every bite was a reminder of the season, the harvest, and the mercy of rain. The staple dish for most was pottage, a humble stew of grains boiled in water or weak broth, thickened with vegetables if any could be spared. On a good day, it might hold a shred of bacon, a bone, or the rare sliver of salted fish. On a bad one, it was little more than boiled barley flavored with hope. Yet within its simplicity lay endurance. Pottage could simmer all day, feeding the household with whatever the garden, forest, or scraps of the Lord's kitchen could provide. It was the sound of life itself, the soft bubbling in a pot that never stopped, from sunrise to dusk. Vegetables grew not for pleasure but necessity. Leeks, onions, cabbage, and beans were the backbone of the common diet. They were hardy, forgiving of poor soil, and slow to spoil. Potatoes, tomatoes, and maize were still centuries away from European shores. For flavor, people turned to herbs, thyme, parsley, sage, or, when luck allowed, a pinch of imported spice, carried across continents by merchants who risked their lives for its price. Meat was rare. When it did appear, it was salted, smoked, or boiled until tender enough to chew. Fresh meat belonged to feasts and noble tables. The rest of the time, even the smallest scraps were saved, dried, or stewed into broth for the sick. The peasantry relied on what they could grow or gather. In the forest, they foraged mushrooms, berries, nuts, and wild herbs. In lean months, roots and bark found their way into pots. Every plant had purpose. Nothing was wasted. They ate from wooden bowls, sometimes sharing from a single pot, dipping crusts into the same broth. There were no separate courses, no ceremony. Eating was quiet, communal, and practical, a moment of warmth before the next hour of work. For the wealthy, food was as much about status as sustenance. Their tables groaned under roasted meats, delicate pastries, and imported wines. Peacocks were skinned, roasted, then dressed again in their feathers for display. Spices like cinnamon and cloves marked privilege as clearly as jewels. Yet even the lords depended on the same chain of labor that began in the fields and ended by the fire. Beneath the surface of their luxury lay the same fear of scarcity. Grain failed, storms ruined crops, livestock sickened, and famine did not care for rank. The line between feast and starvation was thinner than anyone dared admit. Salt was precious, a silent currency of preservation and power. It kept meat from rotting, fish from spoiling, and vegetables from wasting away. It was traded, hoarded, even taxed. A castle without salt was a castle without defense against hunger. People learned to make every ounce count, salting herring in barrels for winter, rubbing pork in brine until it hardened like leather, boiling seawater down to crystals when trade routes failed. It was the taste of life, sharp and enduring. seasons ruled the stomach. In spring came greens and herbs, a reprieve after months of stored grain. Summer meant labor in the fields, quick meals eaten in the shade. Autumn was the season of gratitude and fear, harvest festivals for what was gathered, worry for what was not. Winter was the true test. Food was scarce, fires were weak, and the cold made hunger ache like a wound. People grew thin. They prayed more. Every crumb was counted, every meal stretched as far as it would go. Drinking water was rarely safe. Rivers carried waste, disease, and death. Instead, people drank small beer, a weak ale brewed daily, safer than water and mild enough for children. Cider, mead, and diluted wine found their way into every class, though quality depended on wealth. The poor brewed their own in smoky cottages, while nobles imported wine from France or Spain. Yet even then, drink was not about indulgence, it was about survival. In a world without clean water, fermentation was salvation. For those who lived under the weight of poverty, every meal carried the memory of want. To go without food for a day was common. To go without for 3 could mean death. During the great famines that swept through Europe, people boiled grass, ate bark, and dug up roots from frozen soil. Chronicles tell of mothers trading bread for candles to light their children's graves. The pain of hunger was not abstract. It was the quiet horror of empty pots and silent hearths. And yet, somehow, people endured. They always found something, however small, to keep the fire burning. Even in their struggle, there was creativity, a kind of rough poetry in their food. Dishes changed with what the land could give. Lentils thickened with milk on feast days, onions fried in lard when fat was plentiful, a splash of vinegar to wake up old broth. Recipes were not written but remembered, passed from hand to hand, taught by feel and instinct. In their way, they preserved the oldest kind of wisdom, that food is never just sustenance, but memory, a way of surviving together, of making meaning out of scarcity. At the heart of it all was gratitude. However small the meal, it was blessed before eaten. A crust of bread, a bowl of stew, a jug of ale, all were gifts that could vanish at any moment. Even the poorest knew the miracle of a full belly. They did not eat for pleasure, they ate for life, and in that act lay something sacred. The medieval kitchen, for all its smoke and hardship, was not merely a place of hunger. It was where faith met necessity, where every bite was a prayer whispered to time, asking only for one more day of warmth, one more night of fire, one more meal before the darkness returned. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was not what we imagine from the faint perfume of history books or the polished gleam of modern museums. It was rough, uncertain, and shaped by a world where dirt clung not just to skin, but to life itself. To be clean was not a daily ritual of luxury, it was a brief reprieve, a rare comfort won through effort. Water was cold, soap was harsh, and bathing was a privilege, not a habit. Yet despite what many believe, the medieval world was not a place of total filth. People cared deeply about cleanliness, only their idea of clean was far different from ours. In most towns, the scent of humanity was everywhere. Streets were narrow, crowded, and often slick with waste from both people and animals. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows into alleys, where dogs and pigs rooted through what was left behind. Rain carried it all downhill into rivers, the same rivers that people used to draw water for cooking and washing. Still, amid the filth, there were rules. Cities had fines for those who dumped waste too close to wells, and certain trades, like tanners or butchers, were pushed to the outskirts to keep their smells away from homes. It was not ignorance, but necessity. People did what they could with what little they had. Public bathhouses were once the pride of medieval cities. Long before soap and plumbing filled every home, people gathered in steamy wooden halls to bathe together. The poor paid a few coins for a basin of hot water, while the rich soaked in carved tubs perfumed with herbs. Bathhouses were places of cleansing, socializing, and sometimes sin. They carried the scent of lavender and scandal. Men and women sometimes bathed together, separated only by curtains or custom, and moralists frowned upon their existence. In time, the church began to associate bathing with vanity and temptation, warning that nakedness could lead the soul astray. Yet for centuries, These baths were an essential part of urban life, until war, plague, and fear slowly drained them dry. Soap, when it existed, was a crude mixture of animal fat and lye. It was rough, abrasive, and burned the skin if made poorly. For many, ashes, sand, or even fermented urine were used to scrub clothes and skin clean. Linen undergarments, when changed often, did much of the work that soap could not. People believed that changing into fresh linen drew dirt and sweat away from the body, a kind of dry bath. In noble households, servants boiled and beat clothing in cauldrons of water, rinsing them in rivers until they gleamed white against the mud-colored world. Clean linen became a symbol of refinement, a statement of virtue. Water itself carried risk. Wells could be poisoned by runoff or decay. Streams were shared by animals, industry, and the dead. Many believed that bathing too often opened the pores to sickness. The body was seen as a fortress against disease, and water, if misused, could breach its walls. So people turned to alternatives: scented oils to mask odors, vinegar for washing hands, and herbs burned in rooms to cleanse the air. To be clean was as much about smell as about hygiene. The right scent, rosemary, sage, rosewater, was believed to purify both body and soul. In monasteries, cleanliness took on a sacred form. Monks washed before prayer, before meals, and before touching holy objects. Cloisters had running water carried through stone pipes, and lavatories flushed by streams diverted from nearby rivers. To wash was to honor God. Yet even here, bathing was modest and controlled. Too much care for the body was seen as vanity, and monks were warned not to indulge in comfort. They lived between cleanliness and humility, washed enough to serve, never enough to sin. The peasants, by contrast, lived in constant contact with the earth. They washed their hands and faces daily, especially before eating, but full baths were rare. Water was drawn from distant wells or streams, heavy to carry, cold to the touch. In winter, the thought of undressing to bathe was unbearable. Instead, they cleaned as they could, wiping with cloths, combing hair to remove lice, scrubbing feet in basins before bed. Children were washed in wooden tubs once a week, sometimes more if the weather allowed. Their homes smelled of smoke and sweat, but also of herbs hung from rafters, of soil and hay, the honest scent of life close to nature. For women, cleanliness was both a burden and a mark of pride. They cared for household hygiene, washing linens, airing straw beds, sweeping dirt floors with bound twigs. The clean home reflected moral virtue, not wealth. Women used rosewater, vinegar, or milk to cleanse their faces, believing it kept the skin pure and godly. During menstruation, they used cloth pads or moss wrapped in linen, washed discreetly at night. Privacy was rare, but dignity was preserved in small rituals: the brushing of hair, the rinsing of hands, the care of appearance even in poverty. Among nobles, bathing became an event of ritual elegance. A tub was filled with water warmed over fire, scented with petals, herbs, and sometimes even wine. Servants poured the water, sponged the skin, and dried their masters with soft linen. Afterward came oils and perfumes imported from the East: amber, musk, and rose. To be clean was to be civilized. Nobles even traveled with portable baths, folding wooden tubs lined with cloth, so they could wash while on campaign or pilgrimage. For them, cleanliness was not survival, it was status, a way to distinguish themselves from the masses who could not afford the same luxury. Yet as the centuries passed, public health began to twist under the shadow of fear. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, people began to suspect that water carried disease rather than washing it away. Bathhouses, once bustling, were shuttered or burned. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores to plague vapors. Instead of cleansing, people turned inward, sealing windows, burning incense, and avoiding touch. Bathing declined, and perfume took its place. A faint haze of scent became the mark of cleanliness in a world that feared its own breath. But filth, even then, was never total. People swept their streets, laundered their clothes, and combed their hair with care. Knights cleaned their armor with vinegar and sand, bakers scrubbed their ovens with salt, barbers shaved, trimmed, and bled clients with precise ritual. The medieval world was dirty by necessity, not by choice. Beneath its grime lay a deep understanding of purity, not as a surface quality, but as a reflection of the soul. Cleanliness was moral, symbolic, spiritual. It meant order amid chaos, discipline amid decay. In castles and cottages alike, water still ran as a constant, even if feared. Wells were blessed by priests, and rivers were treated as living beings, gifts from God, capable of healing or harm. The act of washing, even when rare, was often sacred, before a meal, before a ceremony, before death. Hands were rinsed before breaking bread, faces washed before prayer. The poorest laborer, with cracked hands and muddy feet, still knew the comfort of cool water against skin at the end of a long day. Cleanliness was a fragile kind of hope, the belief that no matter how dirty the world became, there was always a way to begin again. In the end, the Middle Ages were not an age of filth, but of effort, endless, imperfect human effort. People lived surrounded by mud, sweat, and smoke, yet they sought light and fragrance wherever they could find it. They washed when they could, prayed when they couldn't, and found dignity even in the dust. Cleanliness, to them, was not a luxury of soap and plumbing. It was an act of defiance, a way of saying, "We are still alive." When the aroma of roasting meat drifted through the stone corridors of a medieval castle or the narrow streets of a bustling town, it was more than a promise of food. It was a sign of hierarchy, of fortune, of survival itself. What people ate in the Middle Ages depended almost entirely on where they stood in the rigid ladder of society. The gulf between peasant and noble was not only in power or wealth, but in the very flavors that touched their tongues. Food revealed everything: class, belief, geography, even the seasons themselves. It was a map of the medieval world, written not in ink, but in bread, broth, and bone. At the very top of this hierarchy sat the nobility, whose tables were laden with spectacle as much as sustenance. Feasts were performances, culinary theater meant to display wealth and command respect. In the great halls of castles, torches flickered against banners while servants carried platters heavy with roasted swans, peacocks, and boars, their feathers or hides reattached after cooking purely for decoration. Spices from distant lands, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, saffron from Spain, dusted the food like jewels, a reminder that the lord of the manor could command the riches of the earth. Meals for the elite were as much political as pleasurable, their abundance a declaration of dominance. The lower nobility and wealthier merchants mimicked this style as best they could, though on a smaller scale. They might serve venison, goose, or capon, sweetened with honey or fruit sauces and washed down with imported wine. Their tables, too, gleamed with ornate trenchers and embroidered cloths, but beneath the grandeur there was discipline. Medieval nobles followed elaborate rules of etiquette, washing hands before dining, carving with grace, avoiding gluttony, and praising God before the first bite. A feast was never just a meal, it was a stage upon which piety and privilege intertwined. But beyond the castle gates, the story changed. The vast majority of people, peasants, artisans, laborers, lived on what the land could offer and what the seasons allowed. Bread was the cornerstone of their existence. It filled bellies and bound communities. Dark, coarse, and heavy with bran or rye, it was sometimes mixed with ground peas or acorns when flour ran short. A good harvest meant thick loaves baked in communal ovens, their crusts hard, their smell earthy and comforting. A bad harvest meant hunger, long stretches where bread thinned to porridge, and porridge thinned to nothing. For the peasantry, meat was a rarity, not a right. Most ate it only on feast days or through scraps salted and smoked for the winter. Pigs were precious because they could eat nearly anything and survive the cold. Sheep were valued more for wool than flesh. Poultry, chickens, ducks, geese, were practical, providing both eggs and occasional meat. Fish, however, was the bridge between rich and poor alike. In coastal villages and river towns, fish was a daily staple, caught fresh or dried, salted, or pickled for storage. For inland peasants, it was a luxury imported from faraway waters. Vegetables, often dismissed by nobles as peasant fare, formed the heart of most meals. Onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans grew in small garden plots beside homes, tended by women and children. They were boiled into thick stews known as pottage, endlessly adaptable, endlessly consumed. A pot hung above the fire day after day, ingredients changing with what was available. Barley, oats, and lentils gave it weight, herbs and wild greens lent it flavor. It was not glamorous, but it was life-sustaining, a quiet miracle simmering over the hearth. For the wealthy, however, vegetables held little glory. Nobles viewed them as food for the sick or poor, preferring the noble foods, meat, bread of fine wheat, and imported fruits like dates or figs. Color and contrast mattered more than nourishment. Dishes were tinted gold with saffron, green with parsley juice, crimson with crushed berries. Chefs were expected to surprise guests. A roasted bird might spill tiny baked pies when cut, or a dish of meat might be molded into the shape of a castle. Every course was a display of human mastery over nature, a reflection of divine order. Religion, as always, governed the rhythm of eating. The church imposed over 100 fasting days each year, when meat and animal fat were forbidden. On these days, even nobles had to adjust. Fish replaced flesh, and meals grew simpler. But simple was a relative term. Wealthy households found loopholes, indulging in elaborate fish pies, almond milk sauces, and sugared fruits shaped like meat. For the poor, fasting meant little change at all. Their diets were already lean and humble. Yet even they treated these days with reverence. To abstain was to show devotion, to endure hunger without complaint. Seasons also dictated survival. In winter, food was preserved with salt, vinegar, and smoke. Cellars filled with barrels of pickled vegetables, salted fish, and hanging hams. Summer brought abundance, berries, greens, and milk fresh from grazing animals. But the most dangerous time was the lean months of early spring, when last year's stores ran out and new crops had not yet come. Hunger stalked villages then, silent and cruel. Peasants chewed bark, boiled nettles, and prayed for rain. Survival was a yearly victory, won through patience, community, and faith. Despite these hardships, medieval food carried deep joy. Feasts marked weddings, harvests, births, and holy days. Music filled the air, mugs clinked, and laughter rolled through wooden halls. Even peasants, who might live on the edge of starvation, celebrated with whatever they could share: a roasted chicken, a wheel of cheese, or bread baked with care. Food was never taken for granted. It was sacred. Every loaf, every meal, was a testament to labor, love, and divine providence. In towns and cities, new flavors began to stir the imagination. The rise of trade brought exotic goods from faraway lands: sugar from the east, rice from Italy, and citrus from the Mediterranean. Markets overflowed with spices, dried fruits, and wines, each promising a glimpse of luxury. Cookbooks began to appear, written not for peasants but for professional cooks serving lords and bishops. These recipes transformed dining into art, layering flavors, blending sweet and savory, turning meals into multisensory experiences. A new class of cooks emerged, their skill judged by how well they could balance power and pleasure on a single plate. Yet for all its glamour, medieval cuisine was deeply practical. Every crumb was used, every bone boiled, every drop saved. Waste was a sin. Bread crusts thickened soups, bones flavored broths, and even animal fat was rendered for candles or soap. Nothing was discarded without thought. Hunger taught efficiency, faith taught gratitude. To eat was to honor God's gifts, to waste was to insult them. By the late Middle Ages, food had become a language of its own, one that spoke of class and culture, but also of adaptation. The rich flaunted their wealth in gilded feasts, the poor survived on pottage and faith, and between them grew a shared understanding of the fragility of life. Every meal, from a peasant's wooden bowl to a king's golden platter, was a reminder that fortune could shift like the seasons. If one were to step into a medieval kitchen at dawn, the smell of smoke and stew would tell the same story, of labor and survival, of comfort and care. The cook, sleeves rolled, would move between hearth and table, stirring pots, kneading dough, chopping roots. The air would hum with the rhythm of knives and fire, the heartbeat of a world sustained by its hunger. Food, in all its simplicity and splendor, was more than nourishment. It was memory, devotion, and the soul of a civilization built one meal at a time. Step into a medieval kitchen, and the first thing that greets you is not sight but sound, the crackle of fire, the scrape of iron against stone, the hiss of fat meeting flame. The air is alive with movement. Shadows bend and breathe against walls blackened by years of smoke. A single hearth dominates the room, its open flame the beating heart of the household. This is where the story of sustenance unfolds, where hunger becomes creation and ordinary ingredients are transformed by heat, time, and human hands. In a world without electricity, gas, or refrigeration, every meal was a battle against decay, a race against nature's clock. Cooking in the Middle Ages was as much art as endurance. The fire had to be fed constantly, its mood watched with an almost mystical understanding. Too hot, and the stew would burn. Too cool, and the meat would spoil before it was done. There were no thermometers, only instinct. Cooks learned by listening, to the sound of bubbling broth, the snap of kindling, the soft sizzle that meant perfection. The hearth was their teacher, their companion, their trial. It was here, in the glow of embers, that recipes were not read but remembered, passed down through gesture and rhythm rather than ink and parchment. In castles, kitchens were vast, echoing chambers filled with life. Servants moved in a dance of order and chaos, some tending to spits, others grinding spices, fetching water, or kneading bread. The head cook ruled like a general, barking commands, overseeing dozens of dishes prepared simultaneously for the Lord's table. Huge iron pots hung from chains, filled with meat stews so thick they could stand a spoon upright. The smell of roasting boar mingled with that of herbs, sage, thyme, and marjoram crushed by hand in stone mortars. In one corner, a scullion scrubbed knives with sand and vinegar. In another, a boy turned the spit with blistered hands, his face red from the heat. Every movement mattered. A single mistake could ruin a meal, or worse, a reputation. For peasants, the kitchen was humbler but no less vital. Often it was just a single-room cottage, its hearth doubling as stove and source of warmth. Pots of clay or iron sat beside simple wooden utensils. There were no plates of silver, no ranks of servants, only the family gathered around the fire. The day began before dawn, with the woman of the house stoking coals from the night before. She stirred yesterday's pottage, adding whatever the morning offered, a handful of oats, a few beans, a shred of bacon, maybe an onion from the garden. Meals were cooked slowly, stretched as far as they could go. The smoke clung to everything, walls, clothes, lungs, yet within it lay comfort, familiarity, the essence of home. Without refrigeration, preservation was the cook's greatest test. Salt was a precious ally, drawn from sea or earth and worth its weight in gold. It cured meat, dried fish, and turned perishables into provisions that could last through harsh winters. Smokehouses filled with hanging sausages and hams became a symbol of security, the promise that, come the lean months, there would still be something to eat. In wealthier households, barrels of salted beef or pickled vegetables lined cellar walls, while cheeses aged slowly in the cool darkness. Honey sealed fruits, vinegar preserved herbs, and fat was rendered into lard to store flavor and calories. In a time when famine was never far away, these methods meant survival. Bread, too, was born in these kitchens, the foundation of all life. The grain had to be milled, often at the local lord's mill for a fee, and mixed with water and salt into dough. In poorer homes, it was baked in communal ovens shared by the village, a weekly ritual that gathered women together. They marked their loaves with unique cuts or symbols to identify them later. The scent of baking bread drifting through the air was both an everyday comfort and a spiritual reminder, a connection to God's bounty. In monasteries, this process became sacred. Monks measured flour with care, kneaded in silence, and saw the rising of dough as a symbol of resurrection. Each loaf carried both labor and faith. Cooking implements were simple but ingenious. Iron pots, cauldrons, and spits formed the backbone of medieval cooking, supported by wooden ladles, knives, and sieves made from horsehair or cloth. Food was often suspended above fire rather than placed directly upon it. the heat controlled by raising or lowering chains. Wealthier kitchens might boast of mechanical spit turners powered by dogs running in wheels or even water-driven machinery. Stone mortars crushed herbs and grains, while wooden troughs held dough as it rose. Every tool bore the touch of a human hand, every stain a story of meals long past. Despite the labor, cooking was not joyless drudgery. There was beauty in the process, the rhythm of chopping, the perfume of herbs, the laughter that accompanied shared work. In castles, cooks took pride in their skill, crafting elaborate dishes for banquets that dazzled guests. In cottages, the act of stirring a pot for one's family was an expression of care as intimate as any prayer. Cooking bound people together. The hearth was both kitchen and church, its warmth both physical and spiritual. Around it, stories were told, songs were sung, and the long hours of labor were softened by companionship. Fire itself was a living presence, feared and revered. It could warm or destroy, sustain or consume. Entire towns had been lost to a stray ember, yet no home could live without it. Tending the fire required skill, arranging logs so they burned evenly, banking coals at night to preserve them until morning. The first task of the day was always the same: rekindle the flame. Without it, there was no light, no warmth, no food. In this simple ritual, repeated daily by countless hands, lay the heartbeat of medieval life. The smells of a medieval kitchen told the story of its season. In spring, the scent of green herbs and fresh dairy. In summer, the sweetness of ripe fruit and roasting birds. In autumn, the heavy perfume of stewed meat and cider. In winter, the sharp tang of smoke and salt. Each smell spoke of work, planting, harvesting, hunting, preserving. Nothing came easily, yet nothing was taken for granted. To eat was to remember the turning of the year, the patience of soil, and the labor of many. Even the act of serving food carried ritual. In noble households, servants presented dishes in order of importance. Soups first, then roasts, then sweetmeats. The head cook watched anxiously from the doorway, knowing a single spoiled dish could mean disgrace. At peasant tables, the ritual was humbler but no less meaningful. The eldest or most honored family member was served first, prayers were whispered, and each bite was taken with quiet gratitude. For all their differences, rich and poor shared this truth: food was sacred. In many ways, the medieval kitchen was a microcosm of the world itself, hot, unpredictable, fragile, and full of life. It was where invention met necessity, where love met labor. The tools were primitive, the ingredients simple, yet what emerged from those smoky rooms sustained generations. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and sharing formed the pulse of an era. Every pot stirred, every loaf baked, every flame tended was an act of resilience, a declaration that life, no matter how harsh, would go on. And when night finally fell and the last embers glowed faintly beneath the ashes, there would be a stillness, the quiet after labor, the peace that comes from a meal shared and a fire kept alive. The medieval kitchen slept then, waiting for dawn to bring hunger again, and with it, the eternal ritual of flame and sustenance renewed. For all its warmth and nourishment, the medieval kitchen was also a place of danger, a fragile balance between survival and disaster. Every meal depended on the uncertain line between safety and sickness. The same fire that cooked could burn down an entire home. The same water that cleansed could carry disease. In a time before science explained bacteria or contamination, people navigated the unseen perils of food and health through tradition, intuition, and faith. To cook in the Middle Ages was to gamble daily with life itself, a test of skill, luck, and divine mercy. Hygiene, as we understand it now, was almost non-existent, yet not from ignorance. Medieval people understood cause and effect. They saw that spoiled food caused illness, that foul water brought fever, but they explained it through the lens of miasma, the belief that bad air carried disease. Kitchens were built near smoke and ventilation not merely for comfort but to keep away the invisible, corrupt vapors that poisoned flesh and soul. Herbs were hung from beams, rosemary, sage, thyme, not only for their scent but their supposed power to purify the air. Ashes from the hearth were used to scour pots. Vinegar washed hands and knives. Every ritual of cleaning was half science, half superstition, and entirely necessary. The greatest threat was spoilage. Without refrigeration, meat turned quickly, milk soured in hours, and fish rotted even faster. Cooks developed a near-mystical sensitivity to smell and color. They could tell by the faintest change in odor whether a joint of beef had one more day of safety left or whether it would soon make the household ill. Spices, so prized by the rich, were not only for flavor, they were preservatives and disguises. Clove and cinnamon masked the taste of age, vinegar and wine delayed decay. Salt was salvation, and pepper was protection. To season food was not just to please the tongue, but to shield the body. Water, the essence of life, was paradoxically one of the greatest dangers. Wells could be contaminated by waste, dead animals, or runoff from nearby fields. Streams that sparkled in sunlight might hide disease. So people drank ale, weak, lightly fermented beer that boiled the water in its making, or wine when they could afford it. Even children drank ale daily, not for pleasure, but safety. To the medieval mind, water was suspicious. Only moving water, drawn from flowing rivers, was considered clean enough for cooking or washing. But in crowded towns, even those rivers ran dark with filth. It was a quiet miracle that anyone survived at all. Poison, too, haunted the medieval table, not the accidental kind, but the deliberate. The fear of being poisoned was an obsession among the upper classes. Nobles, forever wary of betrayal, trusted few with their food. Tasting servants were employed, forced to sample every dish before it reached the lord's plate. Cups were made of silver or horn to test for toxins. Amulets and charms were worn against poison. Unicorn horn powder, often fake, was sold for outrageous sums as a cure. Recipes for antidotes circulated like secret scripture, blending superstition and rudimentary chemistry. A single drop of arsenic or belladonna could end a dynasty, and so even at banquets, every bite was shadowed by anxiety. The poor faced a different peril: starvation and malnutrition. Their food rarely contained poison, but it often lacked what the body needed. A bad harvest could turn a healthy man gaunt within weeks. Bread adulterated with chaff or clay, eaten out of desperation, caused stomach sickness and broken teeth. Diseases like scurvy, pellagra, and rickets crept quietly into villages, their causes unknown but their toll undeniable. The church urged fasting as an act of piety, but for many, fasting was not a choice. It was their reality. Mothers went hungry so children could eat, and a bowl of thin gruel could mean the difference between life and death. Even in noble households, foodborne illness was common. Guests at grand feasts sometimes left with fever instead of satisfaction. Meat might be undercooked near the bone, or fish left too long in transit. Physicians of the time blamed imbalances in the humors, the four fluids they believed governed the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To restore balance, they prescribed diets according to one's temperament and season. A choleric man, ruled by fire, must avoid spicy meats. A melancholic woman, ruled by earth, was advised to eat light fish or fruits. The meal was both medicine and moral lesson, proof that health came not just from food, but from harmony with nature and God. Cleanliness in cooking was deeply moralized. Filth was sin, purity was virtue. In monasteries, where kitchens fed both body and faith, hygiene bordered on sacred duty. Pots were scoured daily, floors swept, and water refreshed with ritual precision. Monks saw cleanliness as a reflection of inner discipline. The same care given to the soul was given to the stew. Yet outside monastery walls, kitchens were often plagued by pests. Rats, mice, and insects thrived in storerooms where grains were kept. Cats became both pets and pest control, earning their place beside the hearth as silent sentinels of hygiene. Fire, though essential, brought its own hazards. Sparks leapt unpredictably from open hearths, igniting straw floors or thatched roofs. A single accident could turn a meal into a funeral pyre. In towns where homes were pressed tightly together, a kitchen fire could spread like judgment across entire neighborhoods. People learned to respect the flame, to bank it carefully, to guard it through the night. Yet fire also healed. Cauterization was one of the few medical practices that truly saved lives. A burn from the hearth might scar a hand, but the same flame, applied with precision, could stop a wound from killing. Against this backdrop of danger, medieval people developed a philosophy of caution and faith. Before meals, they blessed the food. After meals, they gave thanks. Superstition mixed with gratitude, a charm against poisoning hung beside a crucifix, a prayer murmured before tasting a strange fish. Every act of eating was shadowed by uncertainty, and so it became a ritual of trust in the cook, in the land, in God's mercy. Even the senses themselves became tools of survival. People smelled their food before eating, judged its texture, and watched for color changes that hinted at spoilage. Experience became instinct. A seasoned cook could tell the safety of a meal by sound alone, the hiss of boiling broth or the silence of meat that should have sizzled. They had no science, but they had wisdom earned through generations of trial and error. Despite the danger, there was comfort in ritual. Washing hands before and after eating was not merely etiquette, it was protection. The Lord washed first, the guests next, and finally the servants. Water poured over hands into basins shimmered in the firelight like a benediction. The act said, "We are clean, we are safe, we are blessed." It was fragile comfort, but it was all they had. In time, the lessons of those smoky kitchens, the instincts, the prayers, the small acts of care, became the foundation of modern hygiene. Medieval cooks did not know about microbes or toxins, yet they lived in daily conversation with them. Their vigilance, born of fear and necessity, shaped the habits that would one day save countless lives. They stood between hunger and disease, between chaos and nourishment, holding the fragile balance of life in a wooden spoon. And so, beneath the grime and superstition, the medieval kitchen was a place of profound wisdom, a laboratory of survival where every meal was both miracle and risk. In every act of washing, stirring, or tasting was the same quiet plea that still echoes through time. May this food sustain, not destroy. May this fire warm, not consume. May this meal, however humble, carry us safely through another day. At the heart of every medieval household stood a woman whose life revolved around the rhythm of the kitchen. Whether she was a noble lady overseeing servants or a peasant mother stirring a cauldron herself, her world was measured in meals, not by clocks, but by the rising and falling of the fire. The kitchen was her domain, her burden, and her pride. In an age when survival depended on what could be grown, gathered, or preserved, she held the fragile power of nourishment in her hands. To cook well was not merely to feed, it was to protect, to heal, and to love through labor. For the peasant woman, dawn began in darkness. Before the rooster's call, she was already awake, feeding the fire with handfuls of straw and splintered wood. Her hands, chapped from cold water and rough grain, moved with practiced precision. She kneaded dough made from barley or rye, never fine white flour, for that was reserved for lords, and shaped it into loaves that would sustain her family for days. The bread was coarse and heavy, but it filled the belly and gave strength for the fields. Breakfast was not a feast but survival itself. A crust dipped in ale, perhaps a bit of cheese if fortune allowed. Her kitchen was not a separate room but a corner of a single smoky dwelling, where family, animals, and fire coexisted in uneasy harmony. Chickens clucked near the hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth. Pots hung from hooks, blackened with years of use, each one holding the memory of countless meals. Water had to be fetched from the well, carried in wooden buckets that strained her shoulders. Every task was physical, every gesture deliberate. And yet, amid this endless toil, there was a quiet dignity, a sense of purpose that bound her to the land and the lives she sustained. For noble women, the kitchen existed at a distance, a place to be supervised rather than labored in. Yet even for them, food was a reflection of identity and influence. A great lady's ability to host lavish banquets was a measure of her household's power, her husband's prestige, and her own reputation. She directed servants with calm authority, ensuring that spices were measured precisely, meats carved correctly, and dishes presented with beauty. Her dining hall was a theater of abundance, designed to awe guests and proclaim dominance. But behind the splendor, the same anxieties lingered. Was the meat fresh, the bread risen, the wine pure? A single mistake could bring shame or illness, and so vigilance, even among the noble, was constant. In monasteries, it was often women, nuns and lay sisters, who prepared food for entire communities. They approached cooking as a sacred act, blending devotion with discipline. The meals they made were simple but symbolic: bread for the body, fish for faith, herbs for healing. Silence often reigned as they worked, broken only by the sound of knives chopping and pots bubbling. Their recipes were recorded not for pleasure, but for purpose, a careful catalogue of sustenance for souls devoted to God. In these kitchens, food was both service and prayer. The medieval kitchen was also a school, though few would have called it that. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter not through words, but through doing. The feel of dough beneath the palm, the sound of broth at a simmer, the smell of wood that burned too hot or too slow. Cooking was intuition honed by generations. A girl learned not by lesson but by watching, how her mother measured flour by handful, how she tested stew by taste alone, how she judged the season's harvest with a glance. This unspoken education created a lineage of women whose wisdom sustained not only their families but entire communities. In towns and cities, professional cooks began to emerge. Some women, many men, serving in inns, taverns, or the great houses of merchants. Yet even in these places, women remained at the core of daily sustenance. They brewed ale, baked bread, churned butter, and sold their goods in crowded markets. The scent of their labor filled the air, fresh loaves cooling on wooden tables, barrels of ale frothing with foam, baskets of herbs and onions stacked beside them. These women were the pulse of urban life, bridging the divide between farm and table, rich and poor. Despite their indispensable role, women's labor was rarely celebrated. Cooking was seen as duty, not art. Recipes, when written, bore no author's name. The wisdom of countless women was passed anonymously into history. Yet their influence endured in every tradition that followed. The care they poured into each meal became a form of storytelling, silent, enduring, and universal. Even the humblest dish carried traces of their devotion: a mother's attempt to nourish her children against the odds, a wife's effort to please her husband after a long day, a nun's quiet offering to God. There were moments of warmth amid the hardship. On feast days, the kitchen transformed from a place of labor into one of laughter. Neighbors gathered to help, plucking chickens, peeling apples, stirring great pots of pottage. Children chased each other between barrels, men brought in wood and ale. The air was thick with smoke, but also with song. Food, for all its burdens, united people. Around a shared meal, differences of rank or hardship softened. Bread was broken, wine was poured, and for a few brief hours, the kitchen became the heart of joy. But even joy was fleeting. Winters were long, and hunger constant. A failed harvest could undo a year's worth of labor, forcing women to stretch dwindling supplies into something that resembled sustenance. They soaked old bread in broth, ground acorns into flour, and boiled bones until the last trace of marrow was gone. These acts of endurance, invisible to history, were the quiet heroics of the medieval home. They kept families alive when everything else failed. Over time, as towns grew and trade expanded, the kitchen evolved. New ingredients arrived: sugar from the east, citrus from the Mediterranean, spices from faraway lands. With them came new possibilities and new challenges. Women adapted effortlessly, blending the old and the new, creating flavors that hinted at a broader world. Yet, at its core, their task remained unchanged: to transform the raw, the rough, and the uncertain into something that could comfort and sustain. To stand in a medieval kitchen was to stand at the center of life itself. Fire crackled, knives struck wood, voices murmured prayers of thanks or fatigue. Outside, the world was ruled by kings and lords, by wars and faith, but inside that smoky room, it was ruled by the steady hands of women. Their work fed armies, monks, merchants, and children alike. Their labor shaped the health, happiness, and survival of all who depended on them. Though history rarely speaks their names, the echo of their effort lingers still, in every loaf of bread, every simmering pot, every ritual of nourishment that connects past to present. The medieval feast was more than a meal. It was a spectacle, a statement, and a performance of power. It was where wealth was displayed not in gold or jewels, but in abundance. Roasted boar glistening with fat, whole swans served with feathers reattached, towers of bread, rivers of wine, and pies so intricate they could conceal live birds inside. To dine at a noble table was to step into theater, where every dish told a story, of conquest, of hierarchy, of divine favor. The great hall, lit by torches and chandeliers dripping with wax, pulsed with sound, laughter, the clatter of goblets, the faint strains of a lute echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. For a few dazzling hours, the medieval world's divisions, hunger, fear, and cold, vanished in the glow of excess. Feasts were not casual gatherings. They were orchestrated with precision, planned weeks or even months in advance. A royal wedding or a victory in battle could mean a celebration lasting several days, with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of mouths to feed. Entire villages were pressed into service, hunters to bring game, brewers to supply ale, bakers to knead mountains of dough. The kitchen itself became a frenzy of motion, fires blazing in multiple hearths, spits turning constantly, and servants darting between barrels of ale and baskets of fruit. The head cook, often a man of remarkable skill and authority, directed this chaos like a general at war. Every dish, from the simplest stew to the grandest roast, was part of a careful choreography designed to impress the guests and honor the host. At the highest tables, where nobles and clergy sat beneath embroidered canopies, the food was as symbolic as it was sumptuous. The order of service itself followed strict hierarchy. Dishes were presented in courses, each one more elaborate than the last, soups and pottages to begin, followed by roasts, then pies and pastries, and finally, the subtleties, edible works of art designed to dazzle the eye as much as the palate. These subtleties might take the form of sugar castles, sculpted saints, or mythical beasts, crafted from almond paste and tinted with rare dyes. They were marvels of illusion, proof that the host's wealth could bend even food into art. Seating arrangements were equally telling. The lord of the manor occupied the high table, raised on a dais, with his most honored guests beside him. Below sat the lesser nobles, squires, clerics, and visiting merchants, each according to rank. At the far end, near the door and draught, sat the servants and peasants invited to share in the feast's leftovers. Even in celebration, social order was never forgotten. Every bite reinforced who ruled and who served. To be invited close to the Lord's table was to be acknowledged, if only briefly, as part of his circle of favor. The food itself defied the simplicity of peasant fare. Exotic ingredients, saffron, ginger, nutmeg, and sugar, were brought from distant lands, their cost measured in gold. Meat was the centerpiece of every noble feast, roasted on vast spits until the air was heavy with the scent of fat and smoke. Birds of every kind appeared, pheasants, peacocks, and even songbirds, their feathers restored after cooking to preserve their beauty. A roast peacock, its iridescent tail fanned wide, was a declaration of extravagance so striking it became a symbol of vanity itself. Fish dishes, too, were refined, salmon and trout baked in pastry, eels stewed in wine, oysters served fresh from the coast. Drinks flowed endlessly. Wine from France and Spain for the rich, ale for everyone else. Cups were refilled before they emptied, and intoxication was both tolerated and expected. The toasts grew louder as the night went on, voices mingling in a symphony of celebration. For a society bound by scarcity, this abundance was intoxicating, a glimpse of divine favor on earth. Yet beneath the laughter, there was always a shadow. Every feast was a reminder that such luxury existed because others went hungry. The splendor of the hall was built on the toil of fields and kitchens unseen. Entertainment filled the spaces between courses. Minstrels sang tales of heroes and saints, jesters cracked jokes both crude and clever, and acrobats performed impossible feats near the firelight. Sometimes, actors in elaborate costumes reenacted famous battles or biblical stories. A feast could transform into a miniature world, one where art, faith, and power mingled freely. For kings and nobles, such performances were not just amusement but propaganda. They reminded every guest of divine right, of hierarchy, of the order that kept the world turning. The laughter of the hall was an echo of the authority that ruled it. But not every feast ended in harmony. Rivalries could flare between guests, tempers stoked by wine and wounded pride. Words could turn to insults and insults to duels. There are chronicles of banquets ending in bloodshed, of knights drawing swords amid spilled ale and shattered dishes. In some cases, poison found its way into the cup of an enemy, its effects hidden by the chaos of revelry. The medieval feast, for all its beauty, was also a stage for intrigue. Power was built and destroyed across its tables. For the servants and cooks who labored behind the scenes, the feast was less spectacle than exhaustion. They worked through the night, feeding fires, scrubbing pots, and carrying platters heavy with meat. The heat was unbearable, the noise constant. A single mistake, a dish delayed, a wine spilled, could earn punishment or dismissal. Yet when the feast ended, it was they who restored order. By dawn, when the torches burned low and the guests slept in drunken silence, the kitchen staff quietly cleaned away the remnants of glory. What remained, bones, crusts, spilled wine, was often gathered for the poor waiting at the gates. For them, the leftovers of luxury were a feast of mercy. There was a moral undertone to these gatherings, too. The church viewed gluttony as sin, yet it tolerated feasting as a reflection of divine abundance, provided it was tempered by charity. Lords were expected to share their wealth, to feed the needy on feast days, to remember that fortune was fleeting. In this way, generosity became a form of penance. The same table that flaunted excess was also a stage for virtue. Bread was given to beggars, coins tossed to minstrels, prayers murmured for the dead. Even amid indulgence, conscience whispered. The rhythm of feasting and fasting defined the medieval calendar. For every grand banquet, there were days of abstinence, when meat was forbidden and meals were humble. Lent, Advent, and countless saints' days demanded restraint. Fish replaced flesh, wine gave way to water or ale. The cycle of plenty and deprivation mirrored life itself, joy and hardship, fullness and hunger. To medieval minds, the contrast gave meaning to both. The feast was celebration not merely of food, but of survival, of the human spirit's ability to find joy even amid fragility. When dawn came and the candles guttered out, the hall fell silent again. The echoes of laughter faded into the chill morning air. What had seemed eternal only hours before dissolved into memory, the scent of roasted meat, the gleam of wine-stained wood, the faint imprint of music lingering in the rafters. Yet the essence of the feast endured, written into the collective soul of the age. It was proof that, even in a world of hunger and hardship, people yearned to gather, to share, to be reminded, if only for a night, that life, fleeting as it was, could still taste of wonder. As centuries passed, the medieval kitchen began to change, not suddenly, but in quiet, almost invisible ways. The transformation started with the slow crawl of trade, the hum of new markets, and the arrival of strange goods that carried the scent of faraway lands. Each spice, each grain, each new technique whispered the promise of a different world. What had once been local and limited began to open outward, as Europe's kitchens absorbed the fruits of exploration, commerce, and curiosity. It was a slow revolution, unfolding not in battlefields or courts, but in the humblest of hearths. The seeds of change were planted in the late Middle Ages, when trade routes grew bold and merchants braved the uncertain seas. From the east came pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, luxuries once worth more than gold. From the Mediterranean, sugar flowed in delicate crystals, turning from medicine to indulgence. Rice, lemons, and almonds appeared in recipes once ruled by barley, vinegar, and salt. Each ingredient altered not only flavor but imagination. The idea of what food could be, of what pleasure could mean, began to evolve. In this way, the kitchen became a quiet frontier of discovery. Wealthy households were the first to adapt. Their cooks, eager to impress, experimented with these new treasures. Recipes once dominated by salt and smoke began to shimmer with subtlety, meats glazed with honey, sauces thickened with almonds, pastries filled with fruit. The medieval palate, long shaped by necessity, began to crave complexity. Cookbooks appeared, written in Latin and French, documenting the art of combining sweet with savory, spice with fat. The most famous, Le Viandier and the Fermi of curry, became symbols of culinary sophistication. For the first time, cooking aspired to be not just craft, but culture. The poor, meanwhile, remained bound to the rhythms of the land. Their meals changed little, but even they felt the tremors of transformation. Markets expanded, offering new grains like oats and buckwheat. Preservation improved with brining, pickling, and smoking. The spread of mills brought finer flours, and with them, lighter breads. A peasant might not taste cinnamon, but he might eat better bread because of trade that reached across continents. Slowly, the threads of connection began to weave even through the humblest meal. Technology, too, reshaped the kitchen. The open hearth, with all its danger and inefficiency, gave way to enclosed fireplaces fitted with chimneys. Smoke that once filled homes now rose safely through stone flues, clearing the air and making cooking more bearable. Iron grates replaced simple tripods. Pots were hung on adjustable hooks, allowing precise control of heat. By the 14th and 15th centuries, large manors and castles built specialized kitchens, spacious, ventilated, and divided by function. There was a bakehouse, a brewhouse, a scullery, even rooms dedicated to sugarwork or confectionery. The kitchen had evolved into an organism of its own, complex and interdependent, reflecting a world that was learning the same lessons about structure and innovation. As towns grew into cities, the communal aspect of food deepened. Guilds of bakers, butchers, brewers, and cooks emerged, each protecting its craft with pride and secrecy. Apprenticeships passed down skills that would define entire generations. A young cook might spend years learning the proper temperature of sugar syrup or the exact moment to remove a roast from the spit. Mastery took time, and with it came respect. Food had always been necessity. Now it was profession, artistry, even science in its earliest form. The Renaissance dawned with curiosity, not only for art and literature, but for the senses themselves. Taste became an extension of thought. The kitchen reflected this awakening. It became a place of experimentation, where ingredients were dissected, measured, and refined. The boundaries between medicine and cooking blurred, as physicians and chefs alike explored how food shaped the body and soul. Meals were no longer merely sustenance. They became expressions of harmony, balance, and philosophy. The Church's influence over diet remained strong, but even faith began to adapt. The strict cycles of fasting and feasting softened in practice. Fish remained the symbol of piety, but now it was served in ways that pleased as much as they purified. Lent no longer meant deprivation alone. It became a season of ingenuity, where cooks transformed simple ingredients into dishes of grace and beauty. The medieval relationship with food, once governed by fear of sin or sickness, began to shift toward the celebration of flavor itself. Trade did more than bring spices, it brought stories. Each exotic ingredient carried with it tales of deserts crossed and ships lost, of kingdoms risen and fallen. To taste nutmeg was to taste a piece of a faraway island. To use sugar was to join a global web of exchange that connected Europe to Africa, Asia, and the New World. Food became a map of empire, its sweetness and cost both signs of conquest. The kitchen, once local and sacred, was now tied to the fates of continents. Even the act of eating began to change. In early medieval times, people had eaten from shared dishes, dipping bread into communal bowls. But by the late Middle Ages, etiquette evolved. Forks appeared, first in Italy, then slowly across Europe, though many mocked them as absurd luxuries. Individual plates and napkins followed, signaling the rise of personal space and refinement. Dining became performance, not just of wealth but of manners. The rules of the table reflected a changing idea of civilization itself, from survival to ceremony. Yet for all these advances, something of the old world endured. The scent of smoke, the crackle of fire, the rhythm of grinding grain, these were eternal. Even in the most modernized kitchens of the 15th century, cooks still relied on instinct, on touch, on taste. Recipes remained imprecise, measured in handfuls and moments rather than grams or minutes. In that uncertainty, the human element thrived. The kitchen, no matter how advanced, remained a place of intimacy and improvisation. By the end of the Middle Ages, the boundaries between the medieval and the modern had begun to blur. Food had become a language, one that spoke of trade, of faith, of invention. The meals that once reflected isolation now reflected connection. Across Europe, kitchens glowed with new possibilities, their fires burning not just for survival, but for art. The medieval kitchen, once crude and perilous, had evolved into the birthplace of modern cuisine, a testament to centuries of struggle, adaptation, and imagination. And yet, beneath all the change, one truth remained constant. The act of cooking was still an act of care. Whether in a peasant's hut or a lord's castle, to prepare a meal was to affirm life against the cold, hunger, and uncertainty of the world. It was to turn raw, perishable matter into warmth and meaning. That eternal ritual, of tending the fire, of tasting, of sharing, carried humanity through the dark ages and into the light. The medieval kitchen had not merely fed a civilization, it had preserved its soul. When night fell upon the medieval world, the kitchen did not truly rest. The last embers of the hearth glowed like watchful eyes, breathing out the faint scent of ash, smoke, and bread. In those final hours of quiet, after the day's clamor had faded, the medieval kitchen became a sanctuary, a place where memory lingered and stories were told in whispers. Here, in the flickering half-light, one could see the full circle of life reflected in its soot-stained stones: hunger and abundance, toil and celebration, faith and fear. The kitchen was more than a room, it was the beating heart of medieval existence. Every joy and sorrow, every feast and famine, pulsed through its walls. To understand medieval life, one had to understand its kitchens. They were the mirror of the age, humble or grand, chaotic or ordered, sacred or profane. The poorest hearth and the richest castle fire were bound by the same necessity, the need to transform raw matter into sustenance. And in that transformation lay a deeper truth, that civilization itself was born of hunger and hope. Each meal cooked, each loaf baked, was a defiance against the world's cold indifference. The medieval kitchen was, in its own quiet way, a declaration of endurance. The daily rhythm of the kitchen echoed the rhythm of faith. Morning light meant labor, the rekindling of flame; evening meant gratitude, the murmured blessing before rest. Meals were bound to prayer, to the seasons, to divine order. Fasting and feasting, scarcity and plenty, were seen not as misfortunes but as reflections of God's will. The act of cooking became a form of devotion, a dialogue between humanity and creation. Even the most exhausted peasant woman, stirring her pot of thin broth, was performing something sacred. Her hands, chapped and weary, were part of a cosmic pattern older than kings or churches. Yet for all its reverence, the medieval kitchen was also deeply human, full of noise, heat, and imperfection. Arguments flared between servants, laughter broke out among scullions, children darted between barrels and benches. The kitchen was not a place of silence but of living sound, the scrape of knives, the crack of wood, the hum of voices carrying recipes that existed nowhere in writing. It was a place of mistakes and improvisation, where burnt bread might still be eaten, and spilled ale turned into a joke instead of a sin. In this humanity lay the beauty of the medieval kitchen, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a living testament to resilience. As centuries unfolded, that same spirit persisted. The medieval kitchen became the ancestor of every home that followed. Its fire evolved into the modern stove, its cauldrons became our pots, its wooden spoons, worn smooth by generations, turned into the tools of progress. But the essence remained the same, the intimacy between fire and food, between hunger and creation. Even now, when we cook, we echo the gestures of those long gone, stirring with care, tasting with instinct, breaking bread with others. The warmth that rises from a kitchen today is the same warmth that once filled stone halls and thatched cottages 1,000 years ago. For the medieval cook, time was not measured in minutes or recipes, but in seasons. The kitchen was a calendar of the earth: spring greens, summer fruit, autumn harvest, winter stores. Every task, preserving, pickling, salting, was an act of survival against the turning of the year. The smell of smoke on the rafters was not neglect, but memory. It carried the history of every meal that had ever been cooked beneath it, every winter endured, every child kept alive through hunger's edge. The medieval kitchen was the first library of the senses, its language written in taste, smell, and touch. There was poetry, too, in its simplicity. To light the fire each morning was to rekindle the world. The small rituals, grinding grain, slicing herbs, washing vegetables in cold water, connected the cook to both past and future. Through these humble acts, generations communicated without words. A mother taught her daughter how to test a loaf's readiness by its hollow sound. A son learned from his father how to sharpen a knife by ear alone. No parchment recorded their wisdom, yet it endured across centuries. The medieval kitchen kept alive not just bodies, but culture itself. And beyond nourishment, the kitchen offered belonging. It was where families gathered after labor, where warmth replaced fear. Around the fire, stories were told, of saints, of spirits, of ancestors long gone. The boundaries between the physical and the spiritual blurred in the flicker of the flames. Bread baked in those fires was more than food, it was blessing. In a time when death was always near, to eat together was to affirm that life continued, that love could still conquer hunger and hardship. The kitchen also embodied paradox. It was a place of danger, where fire could devour a home, where knives and cauldrons could wound, yet it was also a refuge. It was where healing began after sickness, where soup restored the weak, where warmth drove away the cold. It stood at the threshold of life and death, creation and destruction. Every medieval cook knew that balance instinctively. To feed others was to wield both peril and grace, to touch the sacred edge between survival and loss. Even as the centuries progressed, and the grandeur of castles faded into memory, the kitchen remained. It outlived wars, plagues, and revolutions. Its tools changed shape but not purpose. The art of preparing food, of turning hunger into hope, endured as one of the few unbroken traditions of humanity. The same flicker of flame that once glowed in the halls of medieval England now glows in modern homes across the world. Every time someone stirs a pot, sprinkles salt, or shares a meal in quiet companionship, they participate in an inheritance older than memory. In the end, the story of the medieval kitchen is the story of us, of how people, faced with uncertainty, found comfort through creation. How they turned scarcity into art, and labor into love. It is a reminder that civilization does not only rise in palaces or churches, but in the humble act of feeding one another. The hands that stirred those ancient pots shaped the destiny of nations far more than the swords that defended them. Their work was invisible, yet eternal, a daily miracle repeated across generations. And when we imagine that smoky kitchen now, its dim firelight, its whispers, its quiet courage, we see not just the past, but the essence of humanity itself. The will to nourish, to preserve, to share. The medieval kitchen, in all its rough beauty, stands as proof that even in the darkest centuries, light was never lost. It simply burned at the hearth, waiting to be passed on. Centuries may have passed, but the echoes of the medieval kitchen still breathe through the walls of every home that has ever known the warmth of a shared meal. It is easy to imagine the world that came after, grander houses, finer tools, new discoveries, yet, beneath all the progress, something ancient remains untouched. The scent of bread rising in an oven, the hiss of oil in a pan, the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot, these are the same small miracles that once filled stone cottages and castle halls alike. In the quiet of night, when modern lights dim and silence settles, that timeless rhythm returns. The same comfort, the same sense of belonging that once drew families around a fire, still calls to us across the centuries. For all our sophistication, the truth is that we are still bound to the fire. The act of cooking, of transforming simple ingredients into sustenance, connects us to those who lived and died long before us. When we slice an onion or grind pepper into a stew, we are repeating gestures older than language. We stand unknowingly in a lineage of countless hands that stirred, seasoned, and tasted in dim kitchens lit only by flame. The medieval cook's world might seem distant, rougher, hungrier, shadowed by faith and fear, but their intent was the same as ours: to create warmth, to sustain life, to bring people together through food. In the medieval kitchen, food was never just food. It was a story, a symbol, a thread that bound community, belief, and survival together. To eat was to remember, to honor the earth, the animals, the labor of hands unseen. The poorest peasant and the richest lord were united by hunger, by the same fragile dependence on the turning of seasons. Modern abundance has dulled that awareness, but in moments of quiet, when a loaf is broken, or a meal shared without words, the same sacred truth returns: that to eat is to live, and to cook is to give life shape and meaning. The legacy of those kitchens lives on not only in what we cook, but in how we think about food. Every culinary tradition, every holiday meal, every humble recipe whispered from one generation to the next carries within it traces of that medieval world. Our fascination with farm-to-table simplicity, our reverence for handmade bread, our rediscovery of herbs and natural ingredients, all are echoes of the time when survival depended on understanding the land and its cycles. The medieval kitchen may have been dark and smoky, but its wisdom endures in the modern yearning for authenticity, for something real and rooted. And though we have traded the open hearth for electric stoves, the essence remains. The flame may be tamed, but it still holds the same magic. When we cook, we do not merely prepare food, we summon memory. We bring back the laughter of those who once gathered around the fire, the whisper of prayers before meals, the comfort of full bellies after long winters. In this way, every kitchen today is a time machine, a portal through which the past continues to live. It reminds us that progress does not erase history, it transforms it into new forms of remembrance. There is something deeply human in that continuity, the way a simple act, repeated for 1,000 years, carries the full story of who we are. Empires have risen and fallen, languages have died, faiths have changed, yet the fire remains. It is the most ancient symbol of civilization, both destroyer and giver of life. The medieval kitchen, with all its smoke and noise, was a microcosm of that eternal balance between chaos and order, scarcity and creation, hunger and fulfillment. Its lessons were not written in books but lived, day after day, by people who understood the sacredness of survival. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of history, not the wars or the kings, but the daily acts that kept humanity alive. A pot stirred, a loaf shared, a mother's hand shielding her child from the cold. In those gestures lies the real story of civilization. The medieval kitchen was where that story took shape, not as grand spectacle, but as quiet perseverance. Its legacy endures not because of its grandeur, but because of its humanity. If we listen closely, we can still hear the hum of it, the rhythmic chopping of herbs, the murmured prayer before a meal, the low crackle of burning wood. We can still feel the warmth of its fire, the pulse of its life. The medieval kitchen may have vanished from the world, but it has not vanished from us. It lives in the instincts that guide our hands when we cook, in the comfort that fills us when we share food with others. It lives in the flame that still burns, no matter how modern our homes have become. So when you next stand in your own kitchen, as light flickers across a countertop, as a pot simmers quietly, remember that you are standing in a place far older than the walls that surround you. You are standing at the crossroads of centuries, continuing a ritual that began long before your birth and will outlast your lifetime. The medieval kitchen was never just a place, it was a heartbeat. And that heartbeat has never stopped. Because to cook, to eat, to share, these are not merely actions. They are prayers, written not in words but in warmth, in smoke, in the slow rhythm of care. The medieval kitchen may have been built of stone and soot, but its spirit was eternal, the flame that feeds humanity itself. And as long as a single fire still burns, as long as a single meal is shared in gratitude, that spirit will never fade. The fire fades, but its warmth lingers, not just in memory, but in the rhythm of our daily lives. The medieval kitchen, once filled with smoke, laughter, and survival, has transformed into the quiet heart of every modern home. The tools are different, the walls cleaner, but the meaning remains unchanged. To cook is still to connect, with the past, with others, with ourselves. It is the one ritual that unites all humanity, across time and distance. Each time a meal is made with care, each time we gather at a table, we rekindle that same ancient light that once flickered against stone walls and wooden beams. The medieval kitchen was never just about food, it was about the unbroken thread of life that passes from one generation to the next. And in that soft continuity, we find something sacred, a quiet reminder that no matter how far we've come, our truest stories are still told in the language of warmth, patience, and flame. The hearth may have changed, but the heart behind it remains eternal. And so, as the final embers fade, the story of the medieval kitchen lingers, not as a forgotten relic, but as a living heartbeat carried into every home that still gathers around warmth and food. In each quiet moment of cooking, we awaken the same devotion, the same gratitude that once flickered beneath stone ceilings. The tools may have changed, the world may have evolved, but the essence remains unchanged. To nourish, to connect, to remember. The medieval kitchen was never truly lost. It simply became part of us, an eternal flame glowing in every act of care and creation.